Welcome to Windows on the World, and we've got a great show lined up for you tonight. Lots and lots of information. Climate sense kills consensus. The global local con. Where basically we're going to reveal some important news tonight. All about that. Yes, the global action plan that's being implemented on the back of climate change, and the climate's always changing, as we know. I'm just going to see who's in chat. We've got people in chat already, actually. Eric von Essex is in. Evening, Eric. In fact, I don't think we gave your joke from last week the credit it deserves, because I'm still laughing at it this week. I'll see if I can find it. We've got a lot of people saying greetings, actually. Yes, he said, this is Eric von Essex from last week. If I had a dog that looked like Katie Hopkins, I would shave its bum and train it to walk backwards. I was still laughing at that. Evening, Eric. Yeah, really good joke, that. And yes, I do follow her on Twitter, along with all of the other trolls who are implementing the divide and rule strategy. But I've noticed that there's a growing backlash against the consensus reality being imposed all over the UK and, of course, the rest of the world through the Global Action Plan. But first, I'm going to get into some rather amusing stories which I think our listeners will appreciate. Now, get this. MI5 head Andrew Parker summons Jeremy Corbyn for Facts of Life talk on terror. But the Labour leader has delayed his briefing on threats to Britain. Basically, he didn't go. So, it says here, Jeremy Corbyn has been summoned for a personal briefing by the head of MI5 on the terrorist threat to Britain amid questions about his approach to national security. Andrew Parker, the Director General of the Security Service, is expected to give the Labour leader a full briefing on the threat from Islamists in Britain and ISIS jihadists returning from the Middle East to plot atrocities on home soil. Now, this is absolutely hilarious, because when you look at the press releases and the rubbish that comes out of MI5, you don't really have to think very hard to realise why Corbyn didn't go. The MI5 boss also wants to prime Corbyn on the extent of hostile Russian espionage activity and the growing threat from far-right extremists. This is absolute comedy, and it deserves to be treated with contempt. But moving swiftly on, right, we've got another one that's very, very funny, and it's to do with John Landsman, and he's been asking whether Jeremy Corbyn should be actually retrained because of his views, and basically that he's the anti-Semitic training needs to be imposed on Corbyn. You couldn't make this stuff up. I mean, this is coming from John Landsman, who's just a predatory property developer running Momentum and also the Left Futures website, and he was stating over a year ago that we were going to have to redefine the way that we talked about Zionism, you know, that political movement. So, moving swiftly on, the urbanisation agenda, the corporate takeover of all infrastructure and the taking away of private travel, and of course the rollout of 5G, all very important stuff. Now, this is from Dave Hodges, the Common Sense Show in the US. It says here, it is an old issue, but with a new revelation by the most credible insider source to date. Recently I was contacted by Dr. Paul Batcho. Batcho is a former DARPA senior scientist who worked at Los Alamos and held a top-secret security clearance. In short, Batcho asserts that clandestine forces are purposefully engaging in acts of terrorism against the general public through emission of dangerous frequencies from cell phone and microwave towers in the St. Petersburg, Orlando, Tampa, Florida area. Now, this is very interesting, and it ties into the bigger picture of what we're going to be talking about tonight. According to Waltham Forest Council in East London, 5G will advance equality and diversity. I've just been looking through their document on it. They are right, because everyone will share the health benefits of being radiated by millimetre waves bouncing off the thousands of town centre hubs, increasing connectivity. So along with cycling, microwave weapons and creating divide and rule agitation for the controlling of the narrative, your local council is not liable for anything, or so it thinks, because the Arqiva rollout of 5G hubs, 16,000 to start with in this borough of North East London, many other boroughs are being filled with these cell towers. Basically, they're street furniture on the sides of buildings and in lampposts. And the council will not be liable at all. It's in their own document. So the council are not liable for any of the 5G radiation. Isn't that interesting? So the use of weaponised military technology, such as the active denial system, which uses millimetre wave technology, using phased array systems, is the same technology currently being rolled out in your town centre and reportedly the biggest threat to human existence yet. Yes, the rollout of the 5G infrastructure is well underway, and thousands of new hubs for Wi-Fi are being installed in street furniture in town centres, as we said, all over the country. The recent forest fires in California, this is very interesting, have been reported extensively by Deborah Tavares on stopthecrime.net, and there's some really interesting and disturbing stuff going on with that, and our listeners will probably be aware of it, but if you're not, check out stopthecrime.net. And although there is speculation, really, about how these fires are being caused, the circumstances and a bit of research indicate that this is a programme to clear people out of the countryside and into the cities. This is the Global Action Plan, and by 2050, as we keep reporting on the show, 2/3 of all world populations will be living in cities, according to the UN. When you have the information, no amount of obfuscation and shrinking away will work. So really, what we're doing over the past, I would say, 6 months, what we have been doing is starting to create areas where these people are liable, and it can be done. So your local council is not infallible, and they are actually liable for what they're doing. Now, this is from gritpost.com. This headline was amended from UN scientific paper says capitalism has to die in order for the planet to be saved to UN scientific paper suggests capitalism has to die in order for the planet to be saved. Now, what they mean by capitalism is, of course, freedom to do anything without the interference and legislation and oppression of state governance. That's what they're talking about here under global governance. Capitalism and global sustainability, it carries on, are incongruous with one another, according to a recent paper for the UN's 2019 Global Sustainable Development Report. The team of researchers from various academic institutions throughout Finland who wrote the report gave a sobering assessment of the planet's future if the current economic order continues unabated. Oh yeah, namely that all rich Western countries have based their societies on an abundance of cheap energy, which the scientists say is no longer a reality. Well, it is a reality. It just appears that they don't want it to be the reality, and we've discussed this on many shows before. It ties into what we're going to be talking about tonight as well. So this is poverty for all and coming power shortages. We've been talking about this for ages, as we reported from attending the green climate conferences and talking to the energy suppliers who back up the national grid. They said the future is power cuts. And of course, power cuts mean taking away your power and putting the power into the hands of the state. So artificial scarcity creates poverty and it creates control. That's what they're doing. Economies have used up the capacity of planetary ecosystems to handle the waste generated by energy and material use, the paper reads. Now, this is just absolute treacherous nonsense, and I suppose I shouldn't say that without backing it up, but we will get into why it's nonsense, and also, if you listen to hundreds of our previous shows, you will know why it's nonsense. As we know, yeah, it is rubbish, but it works on those programmed into thinking they are a blight on the earth. You know, that all of those people who've been to school, they're being told that they're a blight on the earth. It carries on. Dominant economic theories, as well as policy-related economic modelling, rely on the presupposition of continued energetic and material growth. Now, this is the biggest con of all, growth. Absolute con. It's all about growth. I thought it was about sustainability in the real sense of that word, not the UN interpretation, which means replacing existing democracy with corporate governance. Now, it carries on. The theories and models anticipate only incremental changes in the existing economic order. Hence, they are inadequate for explaining the current turmoil. Well, that's the typical kind of UN gobbledygook. Scientists argued that worsening climate change is having a drastic impact on ecosystems and biodiversity, and that systems of unchecked capitalism like rising inequality, unemployment and debt, what's that got to do with the weather, are also contributing to the destabilisation of society. Oh, that's where they tag it on, you see. It's like questioning the climate change con agenda with being equated to far right. So if you question the weather, then you're far right. This is how absurd and ridiculous it's got. So scientists argued that, this worsening climate change is having a drastic impact on ecosystems and biodiversity and the systems of unchecked capitalism, and basically is contributing to the destabilisation of society. Now, which scientists argued this, by the way? Which scientists were they? They never actually state who it was. They mean it's made up of consensus garbage, which they cannot even back up. Now, in a sane world, the argument would have been held in public, and the lobbyists for complete control would have thrown their lies into the arena, only to be debunked by the quiet voice of reason. The meaning of science is to prove something through fact. So the use of the word scientist in this context is deliberately misleading, and I think this is a very central point when they talk about scientists, who they're actually talking about. They accuse the other side of not being scientific, but in fact, the people that they're quoting may have skills in areas which have nothing to do with what they are talking about. So basically, we're talking about opinion here. Well, everyone's got an opinion, haven't they? Central banks in the US and the Eurozone have resorted to unconventional measures such as negative interest rates and buying up significant amounts of public debt, researchers wrote. This has relieved some economic pressure, but it can be safely said that no widely applicable economic models have been developed specifically for the upcoming era. More gobbledygook, but absolutely disgusting. What a con. Negative interest rates are part of the plan by the World Bank and IMF to asset strip all individuals so they're dependent on the new totalitarian regime. That's what they're saying here. It's absolutely ridiculous that how they equate this stuff. And you have to wonder who actually wrote this garbage. Well, you can bet they're highly paid and they live in a very distant and remote and autistic spectrum of reality. When they have the cheek to say this relieved some economic pressure, I mean, you just couldn't make it up, could you? While the paper didn't endorse any specific economic system to be used in lieu of capitalism, scientists said it would be necessary to transform the way in which energy, transport, food and housing are produced and consumed. Well, how are they going to do that? Where does all of the food come in? Comes in on lorries to cities. So cycling doesn't really work when you're talking about food delivery, does it? And we're going to get into that later. So yeah, the LBGT and cycling agenda is being pushed to the detriment of just about everything else. So it's a great decoy, but it has nothing to do with what's actually going on. So cycling is the big front for all this, of course. Now, while the paper, it says, while the paper didn't endorse any specific economic system to be used in lieu of capitalism, exactly, scientists said it would be necessary to transform the ways in which energy, transport, food and housing are produced and consumed. You couldn't make it up, could you? With the goal of attaining production and consumption that provides decent opportunities for a good life while dramatically reducing the burden on natural ecosystems. Well, that just means killing everyone off slowly or quickly. And that's where this 5G agenda comes in. Quite handy, I suppose. The active denial system, really. That's what it is. I'll just see what's in chat as we carry on. Well, it's quite busy in chat tonight, actually. Martin's in. The big problem, says Eric, is People watch Attenborough on the BBC and worship him like a religion. They don't realise he's highly paid to read a script. He isn't a scientist. No, what he does is he does voiceovers and they put pictures over the voiceover. So he just goes into a studio and reads a script and then they put pictures over it. How's that being an expert in anything? It's not. But of course, he's had his slippers under the table for so long and he's so spoilt on the BBC gravy train that he'll spout anything, I suppose. And when you hear these deluded people say, well, I've been on the planet 70 years and I've never known the weather to be like this. Well, wait a minute, isn't the Earth's ecosystem about 4.5 billion years old? What's 60 years in that time? I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous, and we're going to get onto that, actually, as the show carries on. Yeah, so what are scientists doing talking about economic models anyway? Can't they stick to manipulating climate data? Well, it all has to be interlinked, doesn't it? So the poverty for all food rationing, having no money and no home, is all about sustainability. Early in the paper, researchers said it would be necessary to implement a global Marshall Plan, as Harvard University atmospheric chemistry professor James Anderson proposed earlier this year. Ideally, such a plan would mean cooperation between countries around the globe to collectively restructure society. Here we go, with the end goal of eliminating carbon dioxide emissions entirely. Now, what does that mean? That means that there's going to be nobody on the planet. These people are round the bend, and I really hope they get what's coming to them. Researchers gave a deadline for the United States and Europe to reduce carbon emissions to zero by 2040 and for the rest of the world by 2050. Yeah, they need to be put in prison, basically, and re-educated into telling the truth. That would be a really good idea. In order to meet this goal, however, scientists cast doubt on the ability of renewable energy sources to be able to sustain humanity's current energy consumption rate. Well, that's true. Solar and wind power can only account for a tiny percentage of energy, and it's absurdly subsidised to the detriment of everyone. The only viable solution, it carries on, is to attain a goal of zero emissions, is, according to the paper, for humanity to use substantially less energy. Scientists are calling on state governments with forward-thinking leaders to test radical solutions at the macro level, like a job guarantee, similar to what Senator Bernie Sanders has proposed in the past. Well, they're trying to get templates of him going all the time, all part of the agenda. And when we read all the stuff that Soros has been putting out, this secret document that was leaked that we put on last week's show, UK Subversives, this is astonishing. When we talk about a shadow government, that's just scratching the surface, really. It says that the most suitable jobs for the programme would be those that almost anyone can do with limited training. The jobs could be modelled to serve the transition to sustainability and to build capacities to adapt to climate change. For example, installing decentralised energy solutions and preparing for floods. Scientists wrote, in addition to triggering the transition, the job guarantee would ensure full employment. It would lessen insecurity and the need to compete for environmentally destructive jobs on the individual and collective level. Well, is that a bit like what they're doing now? So if you do an hour's voluntary work a week, it means that you're employed. That's it. That's the poverty economy. That's absolutely what this is all about. Researchers' ideas for how to phase out capitalism will likely be included in the UN's Global Sustainable Development Report, which will come out in 2019. Can't wait for that. So does anyone with a functioning brain cell fall for this? This is actually a question. Well, no, they don't, but the puppets in Parliament go along with it, and the education system training interns for the new concentration camps openly spout it whenever they can. As long as the concentration camp areas have Starbucks and Costa coffee outlets, many will not notice that they're in an open prison. And this is a really good point, because the borough I used to live in is now an open prison, and people there seem to be quite happy in it, or they seem to be going about their daily lives and not thinking that anything's particularly wrong. So I suppose the Global Action Plan is good in some ways. Eric von Essex, he said to Unique Lee in the chat, have you noticed that people are still having to use the new infrastructure of energy top-up points are firmly in the hands of the private sector, just swapping petrol pumps for electric outlets that the system owns? Oh, that's absolutely it. That's absolutely it. This is why I'm trying to stay off the grid as much as possible. Schools are like prisons now. Well, they are. This was the whole idea of the Global Action Plan and all the stuff that we've been talking about. I mean, we've covered the education system many times and all the information's out there. people know how it works, and the Rockefeller Foundation, etc. We've been covering this stuff for years, and of course social engineers then and now. I would encourage anyone to listen to those shows about Dr. Richard Day and his lecture at Mount Sinai Hospital in 1969, where it outlined the Order of the New Barbarians, as it was called, and what was going to happen. And it's all happened. Everything's happened. Even the fact that people are jogging everywhere in training shoes. That was all predicted in 1969 as well. Eric von Essex, yes, spot on. I bet the price at these electric fill-up points will be higher than petrol. This is what's going to happen, you see. Well, it's exactly what goes on, in that you're encouraged to use some form of technology, then it becomes expensive, then it becomes obsolete, and you have to buy another one. But the batteries, these lithium batteries, they don't last that long really, and they cost a fortune. So electric cars are a con, absolute con. You can only go about 100 miles in them without charging them. Total waste of time, especially for anyone who likes being in a camper van, like Monty Blimpton there. I mean, can you imagine that? Having to stop for petrol, electric. Absolutely absurd. I know somebody who's got an electric car and they quite like it, but they just have one route that they do all the time. It's okay for people who have very predictable lives, but for people who don't, well, no use at all really. However, moving swiftly on, to quote the government UN agents of Reclaim the Power, this website we talked about, the Change Agent website, you know, those that control the narrative. The fight for climate justice cannot be removed from this social and economic context. There you go. From the words of Soros and co themselves. Now, of course they can't, as the scam is based on this premise alone, and once that goes down, the whole con becomes exposed, which is what we're doing. So is climate change denial anti-Semitic? I think it is, actually, when you look at what's going on in the news. Well, it is, as we have reported in previous shows. So the Mayor of London, this is great, he shrugged off a campaign to have a blimp of him in a yellow bikini flying over the capital, saying it's not his colour. Well, he might not be yellow on the outside, but he's certainly yellow on the inside. But he says he appears relaxed about the stunt. Well, he'd have to, really, wouldn't he? I mean, if he started getting angry about that, he'd look even more ridiculous than he does already. He said, speaking to ITV London, Mr. Khan said, if people want to spend their Saturday looking at me in a yellow bikini, they're welcome to do so. I don't really think yellow's my colour, though. Not even a witty retort. He can't even think of anything funny to say. That's how programmed that one is. More than 3,400 people have donated to the blimp. Yeah. Anyway, however, let's move on quickly from that. That's just a bit of nonsense. But on a more serious note, he's probably the most detested mayor of London ever. Check out what it says under the Mayor of London's posts on things like Facebook, you know. I mean, there's hundreds of negative posts. Yes, so 100 miles of roads but no motorways. Driving's still fun on the Isle of Man. Well, actually it is in most of Wales, Martin. It's great. I've done a lot of travelling, and I'm in South Wales at the moment. There's not much traffic here whatsoever. And once you get out on the open roads, you can go for miles and miles and miles in a very, very short time. So that's the opposite of what they're telling us about Agenda 21. Now, this is quite interesting. This is to do with the weather. Now, we're going to get on to something incredibly important, yeah? I'm going to get onto this first of all, because it's probably time to do so, as we've had quite a long intro there. Now, listen to this. This is called The Hunger Stones, and it's from ArmstrongEconomics.com. It says the hunger stones have appeared. While the global warming fanatics are out in force saying, see, the heat in Europe is caused by humans driving their cars around, they continue to ignore history. The extreme heat in Europe this year is part of a cycle. The swings from extreme heat to extreme cold are also not unheard of. Another piece of historical evidence they ignore is known as the hunger stones. Pictured in the article is a hunger stone from 1616. Now, these are stones that they put in the river, and when the river goes down to where the stone is, where the water reaches there, in other words, when the actually start to be revealed by the river, then that means that there's a big change coming. So let's carry on with this. So the Hungerstone from 1616, which has been exposed by the low level of water in the Elbe River. Now this is in Declin in the Czech Republic. Throughout the centuries, there have been these cycles of extreme heat followed by extreme cold. Such events have been recorded when drought has resulted in the low level of water in the Elbe River. This year's droughts in Europe has exposed once again the Hungerstones that have been used for centuries to commemorate historic droughts which warn of their consequences when you see these stones again. The Hungerstones are visible in the Elbe River once more at the moment, so they're there. This is a major river which begins in the Czech Republic and flows through Germany. There are more than a dozen Hungerstones that serve as records of previous droughts, establishing that the extreme heat and drought of this year is by no means unique to history. So tell that to these people who believe because they've been on the planet 50 to 70 years that they can predict and look at the weather with any kind of perspective. So the various Hungerstones record droughts that resulted in famine and soaring prices for food. The droughts that have been recorded on the stones date to 1417, 1616, 1707, 1746, 1790, 1800, 1811, 1830, 1842, 1868, 1892 and 1893, which covers a period of 476 years. This produces an average of 39.6 years, okay? Just applying that average would bring you to 2012. However, when we look closer, note that 2 years, 1892 and 1893, are back to back. This does not reflect two separate droughts, but the peak in intensity. Instead of there being two separate droughts, it is the same, even just extended. That means there were really 11 events within this 407 in the. Okay, I think I actually lost connection there. Thanks for telling me that. Martin, there's a little side issue here. I drive a hybrid car that is petrol and electric drives working together. At low speeds, it's just the electric, so less emissions in jams. Could do the same thing with clockwork, but I don't think it would have the marketing appeal. Great. Excellent. So getting back to this, because I think it's very important effect, and when they're going on about CO2, and back, we are looking at election in market terminology which took place during the 1800s. A study of Greenland and Antarctic ice cores in the 1990s revealed evidence that pointed to a massive volcanic eruption that had occurred in early 1809. The problem that everyone faced was there were no human records of such an event. This meant that it must have been in a region where humans did not record the event. Additional research revealed from tree ring data that there was also a major eruption in 1808. Now, two independent sources were pointing to a mystery. Okay, I think we're back again. We're having several problems here. I'm now actually using a different system, so I'm reconnecting to chat, and we should all be able to hear what's going on. So yeah, we're talking about meteors here. Now, this is really interesting. There's still another theory that strangely comes into play this October and November. The argument is that we pass through a particularly dense section of the Taurid meteor path around every 2,500 years, and this has contributed to legends and climate change. Every year there are South Taurid meteor shower which will peak overnight on the October 9th and 10th this year for the southern hemisphere, and then in the northern hemisphere the North Taurid meteor shower peaks November the 11th to 12th. However, there have been intense meteor storms that led to legends of dragons fighting in the sky, breathing fireballs at each other. Chinese historical records from 540 AD describe dragons fought in the ponds of Kuho. They went westwards. In the places they passed, all the trees were broken. Now, meteorite impacts are by far perhaps the most destructive forces in the solar system. And this is really where we're talking about the massive impact of climate change, and the huge power of nature. And there is evidence that goes back thousands of years that I've studied for quite some time, and I've had people who are researchers getting in touch with me about it and giving me this data of these meteoric impacts and what they've done to the world. In other words, there have been extinction events actually caused by this. So when they're talking about CO2, it's an absolute joke when you compare it to this sort of stuff. However, there are others who suggest that they may have also delivered the seeds of life soon after Earth was born. The oldest impact crater on Earth is also the largest and is located in South Africa. It is known as the Vredefort crater, for it was originally 185 miles in diameter, which struck some 2.2 billion years ago. There is another major impact known as the Chicxulub crater, located in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, which is 93 miles in diameter, that some argue may have wiped out the dinosaurs with a blast that was equal to the estimated energy of 10 billion Hiroshima A-bombs, which took place about 66 million years ago. Now, why aren't these fake far left extremists talking about this kind of thing? I mean, this would frighten them to death, wouldn't it? This would be an extinction event in the making, because they'd all be so scared of it. They would think that, yeah, it must be such a blight on the earth, we better get off it immediately in case one of these things crashes into it. Absolutely incredible stuff, this, and very, very interesting. And when you start looking at this kind of data, you can start to put together counter argument to the Global Action Plan, which was why I got into all that, really. So it carries on here. The last two occurrences they were talking about, which was these massive craters that were made billions of years ago. They then go on to, there's two occurrences that were around 2200 to 2000 BC and 400 to 600 AD. Part of the evidence is that three Middle Eastern regions all contain a calcite material found only in meteorites. They argue that the biblical account found in Genesis describes how the Lord rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven, which is a description of a meteoric storm. Great stuff, this, eh? Absolutely brilliant. So what's Unique Lee come up with here? Mike Bailey has some brilliant material on dendrochronology and certain dates like Justinian's plague and other dust cloud events as far back as the Celtic era. Well, this is interesting because we made a trailer for a documentary. A friend of mine's still working on it, called Britain's Shattered Isles, and it's all about the work of this guy called Comins Beaumont, and he talks about absolutely major catastrophic events which really changed the whole ecosystem of the earth. And in other words, Britain was a much different place thousands of years ago. All makes absolute sense, and it goes into the relocation of geographic regions in the Bible, which is fascinating stuff. I mean, we've kind of strayed onto something here which I think is very interesting, and that's usually what happens. We have interesting tangents which we go off at, but I thought that was an incredible article, and that information is absolutely fascinating. So it carries on anyway. The argument remains that there was a simultaneous fall of the Old Kingdom of ancient Egypt, the Sumerian civilization in Mesopotamia, and the Harappan civilization of the Indus Valley. In total, some 40 cities are thought to have disappeared in a series of catastrophes. Many astronomers believe that the Earth was bombarded by a particular dense storm of meteorites over a couple of centuries every 2,500 years. So the last two occurrences were around 2200 and to 2000 BC and 400 to 600 AD. This is absolutely incredible stuff, right? And ties in exactly to the research that I've been doing in the Britain Shattered Isles project. So what have we got in chat now? Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed way before the Old Testament records. Well, the thing is with all this stuff, it's stories, and we don't really know which particular era it actually happened in, because when we did our show a few weeks ago about Kabbalah, we found that the interpretations of the Old Testament leave quite a lot to be desired, and we also found that the language which is meant to be decoding the universe, and of course the Bible, ancient Hebrew, is not that ancient. It's a composite of Ugarit, Eblate and Aramaic, and it has been absolutely changed over time. So the whole thing is that the whole of history really does need looking at. And once we go back 1,000 years, I mean, I think we're in the dark, because if you go to certain parts of this country, the history only really starts at 600 AD, when the church were getting to the point where they were creating records. And if you go before that, you can't really find anything. You can't find anything of any reliability. And of course, the Romans kept the records and they wrote the history. If you look at that race they call the Druids, then they knew where their kings were and they knew how to divide and rule them, but they knew nothing about the civilization. They just blamed them for these practices like ripping people's guts out and divining the future by them, that sort of thing, you know. Monty Blimpton. Of recent years, I've seen a few shooting stars that are particularly big. They leave trails and look like fireworks glowing bright red. This is interesting, actually. I've seen quite a lot of shooting stars as well. They're quite a sight to behold, and it's one of my aims is to get that telescope pointing up there really and start looking at the sky a bit more at night, and especially things like Saturn's rings, which I've never seen, and you can see. We did a show called The Cult of Saturn. All this stuff is fantastically interlinked, and of course we should be talking about this in relation to climate change, because that's actually what it's all about. But I just want to get back briefly to 5G to kind of round up this part of the show. The 5G rollout and the council propaganda. Now, the recent injunction against Mark Steele, his campaigner up in Gateshead, it's a good case in point. Mr. Steele was a guest on Windows on the World and has been highlighting the rollout of 5G in Gateshead. Now, it appears that the 5G infrastructure is being installed, and this includes 5G antennas in the street lighting. The LED-powered street lights are in themselves a damaging spectrum of light. This is what he was reporting. Mr. Steele confronted councillors in the street and at council meetings. These can be found on his Mark Anthony YouTube channel. The council obtained an interim injunction which prevents him from what they term harassment of the council employees, but it does not stop him reporting on the 5G rollout and its horrendous implications. Now, this is a really important point, yeah, because it's necessary to be able to isolate issues, especially when all remote authority uses psychological subversion by attaching issues which are not related. This case is a good example of that. So there's nothing to stop anybody reporting the rollout of 5G, but these council employees just don't like personal liability. That's all this is about. And in actual fact, getting an injunction against him has actually highlighted how petty-minded they are. These are public servants, and we should be making them accountable. And we've done that on this show, and you can do it too. So when there's talk about climate change, definitely look into the bigger picture. I mean, I'm going to be looking at more of that stuff, this historic data, because apart from anything else, it's absolutely fascinating. So when agents of, let's call it the, let's have a look, the intelligence community, and we're talking about at the beginning of the show, come out and say these things which is not at all uncommon but never widely reported, then this means that there must be ways to counter the agenda, because these people are not working in the public interest. Now, the importance of acting collectively but with no visible organisation is one of the best ideas to overcome those who wish to control the narrative. This is what I've been talking about for ages. See, like the sheer number of these controlled opposition groups, our last two shows, if you look at them about UK agents of subversion, then they outline how these groups work and how many of them there are. There are literally hundreds of them, and that's not counting the ones that Soros is running. And that leaked paper that we talked about last week, it's absolutely horrendous. They're talking about taking down democratic governments. We talked about how Media Action were doing the same, and this woman, this Nazarene Ratcliffe, had been imprisoned quite rightly in Iran for subverting the government. That was on last week's show. But yeah, the sheer number of controlled opposition groups is absolutely staggering, and something, yeah, we've covered for years. Now, this is incredible, right? I wanted to read something out from this Soros campaign because it's absolutely shocking. This was this leaked document, and it's actually available. You can look out for this. It's a 49-page document about total subversion through Soros agitation groups. It says we will apply lessons learned. Generally speaking, and simply put, Democrats got clobbered in the digital space. Digital programs, both tactical and messaging, fail to actively listen to and engage the online grassroots universe. So you see, if it's not them controlling the narrative, then they are absolutely subversive about the way they're going to do it. The Trump camp spoke effectively to the grassroots and relied on online channels to disseminate information and misinformation and influence the media, even getting fake stories onto cable TV. Now, what are they talking about here? Because all he was doing was calling out them as being fake news, which they are. So the whole thing's about subversion. I would recommend that anybody out there read this. It carries on. In the next 4 years, Media Matters will continue its core mission of disarming right-wing misinformation. Basically, read for right-wing anything that is about sovereignty and having some kind of individual voice. This is all about this mind-numbed collectivism. It carries on while leading the fight against the next generation of conservative disinformation, the proliferation of fake news and propaganda now threatening the country's information ecosystem. It carries on. Here's what success looks like. Now, remember, there was this useful idiot called Saskia Kent screaming out when she destroyed the Occupy at St. Paul's in London. She was screaming out, "This is what democracy looks like." It was like 10 screamingly mad, raving, loony Marxists and a dog. Serial misinformers and right-wing propagandists, it carries on, inhabiting everything from social media to the highest levels of government, will be exposed and discredited. This is the slander angle, you see. Everything is about slander. They slander people. And once you get used to this and what it's about, it stops working. Look at the Corbyn campaign. The Corbyn coup's been going on for, what, a year and a half? And it's reaching epidemic proportions. You've even got Luciana Burgess saying basically, well, do you want me or not? Well, it's up to her whether she goes, isn't it? I mean, this is the thing. It's like, keep playing the victim. Keep playing the victim at all times, you know. Internet and social media platforms like Google and Facebook will no longer uncritically and without consequences host and enrich fake news sites and propagandists. Read for that means anything that they don't like, anything that's about freedom of speech, basically. Toxic alt-right social media fueled harassment campaigns that silence dissent and poison our national discourse will be punished and halted. Now, this is really revealing stuff. And they go, Trump will be defeated either through impeachment or at the ballot box in 2020. I mean, this is open subversion. This is absolute well, it's bordering on criminality. It's encouraging criminality. The balance of power will shift back to Democrats. We will measurably impact US Senate and state legislative races. We will free ourselves from solely relying on the press. Our robust digital program will reach voters directly online. Now, when it says we will free ourselves from solely relying on the press, most people who are thinking and are not part of their paradigm are already doing that. So I think they should be talking about the other side. Yeah, Monty Blimpton, it was a masterclass on consensus building and decision building. Absolutely, yeah, spot on. I mean, we've covered all this in great detail. Sometimes I feel as though I'm going over things again and again, but we always have a new angle on it. I mean, I think that show we did last week was really, really powerful, because when we got into all this stuff and this latest thing of this Maajid Nawaz, this was absolutely incredible, and I did an article on it which contains the article which we were referring to, along with a lot of other information about this Quilliam Foundation. Of course, it's a registered charity, you know, and I've done an article on Windows on the World, and it's called State Subversion, Maajid Nawaz and Quilliam, and the photograph says it all. The pantomime of him, this Maajid Nawaz, this reformed jihadist, is sat next to Tommy Robinson. So it's basically, one's going to be the hero, one's going to be the villain, and they can keep swapping over in the eyes of the public. That's the way it's done. The whole thing's absurd, this left-right nonsense that's going on. I mean, when you actually take it apart, and which we do pretty much every week, it's absolutely blatantly obvious what's going on and how to actually disseminate it all. So I don't think anyone's got any excuse anymore, really. But yeah, it's absolutely incredible, this article. And it all started up with one of our listeners phoning up Maajid Nawaz and getting this absolutely subversive interrogation. And this is the thing, these people, they're put in these positions and their sense of entitlement is off the charts. They take the breath away of ordinary people who just want to speak truth. This is the problem with this level of propaganda. It leaves people in a state of shock. Unique Lee says, if only the media took notice of it, but let's face it, the UN is a root problem on all levels when it comes to usurpation of English common law. Well, it is, because the whole idea is to take that away. And they have been doing that in their own eyes quite successfully. And of course, we've got the legal changes, the infrastructure bill, you've got the Localism Act, and basically everything that went on since Cameron came in with his big society and the Saul-Alinsky rules. Now, here's a bit of a tip. The Saul-Alinsky rules state that basically humour is a man's best weapon, but these people don't have a sense of humour, and that's where it all falls down for them. They can look absolutely ridiculous, and the fun part of all this is making them look ridiculous, making them look as ridiculous as they actually are. And yes, the whole of that article, I would recommend people look at it. WindowsOnTheWorld.net, State Subversion, Maajid Nawaz and Quilliam. Do take a look at that article. So let's get back to what we were going to be talking about. There's quite a lot on the agenda here still to get through, actually, which I haven't got through yet. But let's let's talk about subversion again. Yes, what we mean by frontline communities. This was off this Reclaim the Power website. Frontline communities. We recognise that some communities disproportionately face the harsh impacts of environmental degradation and climate change. We work in support of such communities in Britain and in solidarity with those elsewhere where possible. Whenever you see the word solidarity, you know that you're dealing with these idiots. Consensus-based decision-making. Consensus decision-making is a creative and dynamic way of reaching agreement between all members of a group. No, it's not. It's subversion of a group. That's exactly what it is. Subversion steering through Delphi technique. Now, these are the decisions made by remote authority who are lying and cheating to get their way. And in last week's show, we did discuss a lot of this, so I won't go into much more of that. But basically, we've got the last few minutes of the show. I'd just like to go into what we were talking about at the beginning. Speaking at an event organised by the Jewish Chronicle, Lord Mandelson stated he's working every single day to oust Jeremy Corbyn as Labour leader. Well, it's not just you, Mr. Mandelson. The Labour peer said Mr. Corbyn was living in a parallel universe, and that he felt a duty to rescue the party from his leadership. See how subversive the language is. Lord Mandelson, who is one of Blair's closest allies, said on Monday night that Mr. Corbyn had no idea in the 21st century how to conduct himself as a leader of a party, putting itself forward in a democratic election. You can't believe that. They've got more front than Margate, these people, haven't they, you know? So I actually saw that Mandelson coming out of Oxford Circus tube station, and he is living proof that They Live is a documentary, because I did have my They Live glasses on, and he indeed was a reptilian creature. Question mark. Seen as Labour, the old Liberal Party, is essentially Fabian socialism. What's the point of ever choosing Fabian socialism over conservative communism? Well, that's not really the point, because it's all about strategy. So when you go back to the old-fashioned left, there's more chance of them actually standing up for individual rights than the Blairites and the Tories, who are the same party. So we've got one party that they want to enforce. And because Corbyn isn't exactly fitting the mould there, then they're against him. And in my view, anyone that they're against is probably doing something that's right. That what he's actually doing right is breaking a mould. He's actually got on with what he's doing and been attacked consistently for 18 months and he's still there. Now that says something about public opinion. That's my main point. All this stuff about the old-fashioned Fabians and the old-fashioned left, yeah, it's very, very relevant. But I think we're in a post-truth world now. That's my view, that this post-truth world, we're living in this narrow corridor of accepted opinion, and anyone outside it should be looked into. That's why they hate Trump. That's why they hate Corbyn. And people who can't see that need to just be a bit more subtle in their approach, I think, because, yeah, we've done all the stuff about the Fabian Society. We know all about the Tavistock Institute. We know all about the psychological subversion. We know the whole lot of it. But when it comes down to one group dictating to who's in power, we talked about this Israeli lobby and the Shai Massot, the Israeli agent basically subverting British democracy. I found an article from last year stating that he was going to be hauled up and the whole thing was going to be a huge investigation about Labour and Conservative Friends of Israel. Nothing happened. So that tells you what sort of reality we're living in. And I don't particularly endorse right or left, but what I do look at is the strategy that's going on behind it, which is interesting, because a lot of this Agenda 21 stuff can be turned around with people like Corbyn, because obviously he is more for reality than consensus thinking. And that's where I think you can find something of interest. But basically, yeah, this thing that happened last year when they were going to take down the MPs, nothing happened at all. You know, I had a whole load of stuff I was going to go into it, but I'm going to round off in a minute. But yeah, maybe we can get into that next week, because there has been some updates on that too. Yeah, nothing has been done, and the likes of Mandelson and Hodge, along with numerous change agents and media subversives, are still attacking Corbyn in the same way. So they're still doing the same thing. The encouraging thing is that the attacks no longer work. And this is what I think's interesting about it, is that the more that they're throwing this stuff, this nonsense and the lies and the slander, the less it's working. And I've found that to be generally the case, because I've come up against it myself. And the subversives who keep doing the same thing over and over again have got no imagination. These people are not creative in the way that they move. And that, to me, is where something interesting is going on. Yeah. So there you go. Isn't Margaret Hodge horrible? Yeah, she is. I mean, that's my opinion anyway, you know. And I think it's the opinion of many people, because it's quite obvious that we're dealing here with subversives. Now, I'm going to sign off, and next week I think we'll have a historical show, but I'm going to be researching more of this history of climate, because it ties in so much with ancient history, which is fascinating and of which is greatly of interest to our listeners, I think. So that's great. Thanks a lot, everybody, for listening in and being in chat. And I'm continuing to move about around the country, and I'm seeing what's going on. So when I get back to the southeast, it'll be interesting to compare what's happening in the rest of the country. So that's it from Windows on the World this week, and I will see you all at the same time next week. And if you have anything of interest, please send it in, because I'm getting information from all over the country. I mean, we've got the original Agenda 21 documents from 1998 now, so none of these councillors can say it's a conspiracy theory when their names are on it, can they? So keep sending me stuff and keep working below the radar, and I'll see you all same time next week. That's it from Windows on the World.